afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session on historiography. Just to cause confusion, which we can always count on my colleagues to do, rather than 2 papers, there will be 3 papers, because Mike assures me, Mike Williams, that he and Mike Foley have not fallen out, but they will still be presenting separately. I'm delighted to introduce someone who needs no introduction at all. Professor Chris Brown from the LSE, who wants to sit down while he talks.
Put in a rather unfortunate way. I don't mind. Thanks very much for that touching introduction. When Ken first asked me to speak at this conference, he said, "Would you talk about Ken Waltz and human nature?" And I said, "No, I don't want to talk about that." I said, "I'm interested in human nature, but I don't think. Can I talk about classical realism?" So he said, "Yeah, that's okay." So I've ended up talking about human nature, which, as I said to him, it just proves that I always do what Ken tells me, but only after trying everything else first. But I do want to talk actually about the relationship between Waltz and classical realism. The first half of the paper, which will be cut, I think, with the published version because it's too self-obsessed, is it's about how you read texts. And I want to argue that this is Waltz, to my mind, clearly is a classic. There are some people who pretend it isn't, but when they pretend it isn't, what they mean is they don't like realism, or at least they don't like the content. They're not actually denying the status of the work. But how you read classics is a really tricky business. I talk a bit in the paper about a quote-unquote symptomatic reading. I quote Jameson, a literary critic, who is slightly more comprehensible than Althusser, it's saying that really any text, any interpretation presupposes, if not a conception of the unconscious, then some mechanism of mystification, in which it makes sense to seek a latent meaning behind a manifest one, or to rewrite the surface categories of a text in a stronger language or a much more fundamental interpretive code. To my mind, that happens an awful lot with the work of Waltz. Sometimes it happens explicitly. Rick Ashley does that deliberately. A lot of other people don't know they're doing it, but they do it. They dig into the text and they produce things that weren't there. The trouble I find with that is that there's no kind of reality check. It ends up as being meaning you can make any text mean anything. And that seems to me not good. So the approach I would prefer would be the kind of Quentin Skinner approach. As a British political theorist, of course, I have to recognise Quentin is God. It's almost written into the contract. And to my mind, the Skinnerian approach to texts is a very good one. It's quite complicated, but 2 things are important. You ask, what is a text doing? And you focus on context. What is it about for the writer? Not what it's about for us. That is a question, it's an interesting one, but if we're trying to understand what Waltz is doing, we have to read Waltz when he was writing it, as it were, not now. And this is very difficult for a variety of reasons. It requires a lot of scholarship at a very high level, which of course Quentin has, most of us don't. There's also the problem of getting past everything that's happened since. And I've listed a lot in the paper, I won't go over them. In the 1980s, you had all the posts, the post-structuralist, the post-positivist, postmodern, feminism, gender, later Lacanian psychoanalysis, list after list of new things. But also, and this we forget, there are other categories that are not post at all, but which really didn't exist in 1979, or to be more accurate, in between sort of 1973 and 1978, which I presume was when the text was written, the first bit being from the Handbook of Political Science. So the very concept, for example, of classical realism, I was a student back in the late 60s. We didn't talk about classical realism, we talked about realism. Classical realism, in a sense, is something that's a reaction to modern realism. The English school, hate to tell you, Nick, but people didn't believe the English school existed until Roy Jones attacked it. You know, when I studied international theory, I read Diplomatic Investigations, major book, and Ball, White. I never thought of them as being different from the American realists. It's only when Jones got stuck in and said they were, and then you guys said, "Oh yeah, that's good, here we are." You know, this actually happened. So recovering the context of Ken Waltz's work is incredibly difficult. I use a musical analogy here, which I won't go into because everything I write nowadays has musical analogy. After a little while, it gets boring. What I do say, though, is that although it's very difficult to get back there, I can do better than most because I actually reviewed the book in 1980, published in 1981 in a review essay. And so I do know what I thought about it then. And also what makes it better from the point of view of this discussion is the review it was written without any agenda, if you like. Because the purpose of the review essay was a savage attack on John Burton, who, trust me, deserved it. And so I was, in a sense, I was talking about Waltz without having a personal sense that I want. So how I wrote about him then, I find quite interesting. Rereading it after 28 years, it's terrifying, really. I don't remember any of it, I have to tell you this. But I found it quite, interesting. I doubt if you will, but I mean, I found it extremely interesting. One of the things I think that comes through that is how very different the debates were. The big debate at that time was with Morton Kaplan, as I'm sure Ken will remember. You know, it's quite a squawk of rage is the way I describe it in the paper from Kaplan, coming out of the 75 paper, which was absolutely, I mean, Kaplan's work nowadays, hands up those of you who are under 40 have read System and Process in International Politics. Exactly. Die Without Trace. I mean, is it Sage, David, who published the classics in political science for ECPR? Because that's just been republished, and before they republished it, a guy at Cambridge asked me, "Is this a classic?" I said, "Yeah, it is, but nobody's going to buy it." And they republished it. Apparently nobody has bought it. so it serves them right for taking notice of what I said. But what's interesting is that the discussion at that stage was about structure. And I was very interested in structure at the time, because I was much more Marxist then than I am now. And some of the things I was saying there I thought were quite good when I look back on them. The need for junction concepts, that you need some way of going from structure to process. And in fact, as I note in the paper, I did pick up E.P. Thompson's Poverty of Theory, and say that this was an incredibly interesting way of getting into some of these issues. And kind of Rick Ashley made a name out of that a couple of years later. Did I get a credit? No, I did not. But what's interesting is there was no sense in the paper, to me, that Ken had any disjuncture with classical realism. What we now call classical realism. As far as I was concerned, this was a realist text. It had some things that were kind of different, the emphasis on anti-reductionism and so on, but a lot of it was not. A lot of it, he presents a strong and sophisticated account of the working assumption that states are unitary action. I called it a masterly critique of theories of interdependence. If you doubt that, go back, reread it, and use the word globalization instead of interdependence, and it's still a masterly critique of theories of globalization. If more people had read that, Justin would have had to write the book attacking David Held and my ex-director. My judgment then was that, it wasn't a judgment that he was part of the mainstream. I just assumed he was part of that mainstream. Yeah, what's interesting to me is one of the features of the debates of the 80s and 90s is the way in which that's not considered to be the case by virtually everybody. A lot of the people who consider themselves heavily influenced by Waltz think of neorealism, Waltzian neorealism. They think there's been a rupture here. And of course, a lot of the people who critique him also think there's been a rupture here. So I didn't get a sense of discontinuity, whereas lots of people think there is this discontinuity. So what went wrong here? As I said in the paper rather modestly, I discount the possibility I might be completely wrong, obviously false, and try to look at reasons why people think that Waltz's realism is different from past realism. I have to say, I think part of this, and perhaps a bigger part than it suggests in the paper, is about the rhetoric of academic argument. Classical realism was invented to attack neorealism. There's a sense in which you take people who would have been your enemies if you'd been their contemporaries and use them against people who are your enemies today. I think that happens quite a lot. Figures like Morgenthau and Carr, Rick actually does it in his paper, I think, quotes the wise diplomatic approach of Carr. I've never seen it myself, but he talks about how these guys were in contact with the real world in the way that these neo-realists, Rawls, Gilpin et al., aren't. So there's a rhetorical device whereby you rewrite the past in order to make a point in the present. And I think that's happened in a very big way with Waltz's work over the last 30 years. But I think there's a more fundamental reason, more academic reason, if you like, about the relationship between Waltzian realism and the tradition, if you call it that. And that is that, putting it at the most basic, very clearly, Waltz places the emphasis at the structural level, whereas I think many people believe, basically correctly, that classical realism, in quotation marks, is reductionist. It goes at another level, and especially the level of human nature, why people are, that this is the driving force, not structure. So I think there is a genuine difference here, although it's a difference that's made more of, it seems to me now, than certainly I would have done some time ago. I think you can see this both in terms of 20th century realism and in terms of precursors. Now, I have to say straight off that I tend to the view that realism is a 20th century doctrine, and that the so-called roots of realism, the original figures, the figures who are usually given, the Thucydides, Machiavellis, and so on, are not really roots of realism. They may contribute something to the game, but realism as a political doctrine is a mid-20th century doctrine. There's a very nice quote by Philip Bobbitt in his most recent book. It's in a footnote. He said, he sees realism as 20th century doctrine. He says, modern realists are like people who just bought a stately home and they leave on the wall the paintings of the ancestors and pretend they're their own. Essentially you've got Thucydides up there and Machiavelli up there, and you bought the house, so you're saying, well, these are our predecessors. Well, they're not. But I still think there are some points of contact here with those past figures which are worth looking at. And I think they do I would argue they do on the whole defend the proposition that they look at what Ken would also call the first image explanations. I mean, Thucydides is a classic illustration. You find in Thucydides for sure structural points. I mean, the famous ones about the Athenian, when the Athenian representative explains to the Melians that they're only doing what anyone in these circumstances would have done. It clearly puts that position forward. We've done nothing remarkable in another speech that say, not contrary to ordinary human behavior. If we not only accepted an empire when it was offered, but also did not let it go, submitting to the great forces of prestige, fear, and self-interest. Now what's happening here is a combination of the two. You've got a bit of structural stuff, but I think the great forces of prestige, fear, and self-interest are essentially what drives things forward for Thucydides. So I think ultimately he is a first image writer, if we could use those terms. I think the same is actually true of Rousseau. Rousseau is one of the favourite sources for structural realists because of the stag hunting, which I see is on the menu for tomorrow. I'm not a stag. Breakfast may be a bit more heavy than I thought. Certainly Rousseau features tomorrow, I think, at some stage. And of course, it's the parable of the deer and the hare is a very powerful one. But it does rely on a sense of what human beings are like. The reason you desert the hunt is you care more about your own interest than you do about other people's. You're prepared to satisfy that in those kind of circumstances. Ultimately, I think they're offering first image accounts of the motor forces of realism. And Thucydides and Rousseau, to my mind, are the best friends that the structuralist realist can find. If you go to Augustine and the Augustinians, clearly the context of this is very much first image, with maybe a tinge of second image, but mostly I think first image. Political leaders are obliged to operate in a fallen world, the city of man as opposed to the city of God. They must be wise and prudential. Also, Augustine would hope, just wielders of power. Got nothing to do with structural features of the international polity. I mean, from Augustine's point of view, this was as much about the Roman Empire that was just declining as it was about the successor states that still hadn't arrived when he was writing. Machiavelli, I think, simply takes it for granted that politics is about the pursuit of interests and power. The unstated assumption is that Duke Valentino seeks to extend his power because that's what you do, because he can. You don't really need another explanation. So, I want to suggest a key feature of Waltz's thought, one that genuinely distinguishes it from classical realism, is this theory is not derived from the theory of human nature. Indeed, human nature doesn't even appear in the index of theory of international politics. Well, I think it appears at various points elliptically, at least in the text. Man in The State of War, of course, does talk a lot about human nature, but of the three images set out in there, the first two are collapsed into the category of reductionism. And when Waltz wants to illustrate reductionism, he takes a theory of foreign policy. Lenin's theory of imperialism is what he turns to. I think, incidentally, if we were to have a sidebar on that, I think he gets Lenin's theory of imperialism wrong, but never mind. That's not the point I particularly want to make. He's pushing to that, not human nature. Why is this? Now, I think the answer to this is not as easy as people think. The standard answer that's given, and I think it's already come up a couple of times in the conference and it'll come up again, is that human nature is a constant, but whereas war isn't. So the 1910 and 1914 quote that we usually get. I want to suggest that Waltz's view is actually more complicated than that. And of course, it's interesting, stroke worrying, to see if he agrees with that. This morning, all sorts of views were being attributed to you, and you sat there quietly. And I think, what's the most outrageous view I could attribute to you that should actually provoke you into action? Tomorrow afternoon, you get your chance. So that's cool. But my sense is that Waltz's understanding of human nature is much more complicated than that, and it's quite difficult to get to. Now, as I say, in theory of international politics, we don't talk about human nature very much. Man, the State, and War does, but this is a great book which is built around a series of interlocking debates between different authors, classical and modern. It's not always clear what Waltz himself thinks about this subject, and I think this can lead to real confusion. I'll give you an example of real confusion. There's a writer called Annette Freiberg-Inan, who I think has written a very interesting book on human nature and realism, and she quotes the following: our miseries are ineluctably the product of our natures. The root of all evil is man, and thus he himself is the root of the specific evil, war. But she then goes on and says, gosh, that sounds like St. Augustine, which indeed it does. But it could be the reason it sounds like St. Augustine is it's right in the middle of a patch describing St. Augustine's views on human nature and war. So, it may well be what Ken Waltz thinks is at the heart of human nature. If it is what he thinks, then that's interesting insofar as it's got a kind of theological dimension that doesn't really appear in other areas, because I think evil is ultimately a theological term. It can't be given secular meaning. But I'm not sure it's simply from the text, it can be asserted that that is his view. Let's assume for a second that it is his view. It's clear from the rest of the book that even if he thinks that, he doesn't think this sort of generalization about human nature gets us anywhere. And for that, a different kind of explanation for war is needed. Why doesn't it get us anywhere? I think you get that's the point at which he parts company from the tradition, I think. And as I say, some people say it's because it's an unchanging human nature, whereas war is a variable in some sense. I don't think, I might be completely wrong here, but that's actually why he moves away from human nature. I think he gives us other reasons later. There's a quote which also comes in a context of a discussion actually of Montesquieu and Rousseau in this case. But I think it's much closer to the overall position. Because of the difficulty of knowing such a thing as a pure human nature, because the human nature we do know reflects both man's nature and the influence of his environment, definitions of human nature such as those of Spinoza and Hobbes are arbitrary and can lead to no valid social or political conclusions. And I think that's much closer to the spirit of the book. Reconstructing and rearranging the argument, it seems to me that what he's actually saying is that while we humans do indeed have a nature, and perhaps judging from the existence of evil in the world, that nature is such that sometimes evil consequences flow from it, we can't actually specify this nature much beyond that, at least not in any scientific way. In any event, in practice, nature and nurture cannot be treated separately. Therefore, an emphasis on human nature gets us nowhere if we want to understand social phenomena. Now, I think that's an interesting position and slightly different from the standard one that's attributed to him, so I'll be very interested to, at some stage, maybe to get his reaction to it. But what makes it interesting to me is it touches base with both the main traditions of realism, if you like. There's a tinge of the Augustinian here. The emphasis of evil, if in fact it is his emphasis, links Waltz to the righteous realist, the Augustinian trend of thought identified by Rosenthal, Murray, and others. Augustinians draw political conclusions from this position. Their realism is a realism of prudence, where we are enjoined to question our own presuppositions and values, turn away from ambitious projects of social reform, doomed to failure because of the imperfect human material from which society is constructed. Human beings may strive to be moral. For Augustine, they can only get there with God's help. But collectivities will always be egoistic. And you see Reinhold Niebuhr, and I was amazed nobody did Niebuhr as a essential book last night. I think there's little in practice here with which Waltz would disagree, but I don't think he gets to this position from an Augustinian route, even if it has the same starting point. From his perspective, and given his commitment to social science, and please God, let's not talk about what that means anymore, to a particular version of what social science involves, the Augustinian route leads to a dead end. It leads to metaphysics. It seems to me that's one big difference between Morgenthau and Waltz. Morgenthau's happy with the metaphysics. Morgenthau's best book is Metaphysics, Scientific Man and Power Politics. But that's not the ambition that Ken Waltz has. So Waltz is not an Augustinian realist, even if he shares some of the pessimism characteristic of that genre. But he doesn't follow the Hobbes, Spinoza, Machiavelli route by talking about the drives produced by an unchanging human nature either. Again, there's points of contact with this, I think. Human nature may not be a constant, but notions about the interests of states occur in Waltz, and they do seem to be pretty constant, it seems to me. I don't want to get again into the business of whether he has a rational act or assumption, but I think he does have an assumption that states have particular kinds of interests, in particular, of course, the interests in survival, and these are pretty constant. So there are points of, even though I think the rational choice realists who came on afterwards, to some extent are distorting what he's doing, and my sense is he's not very happy with these guys. I think there is some connection between their world and his. Still, what I really want to say is the most important and the most paradoxical reason why Waltz is so difficult to relate to the roots of realism is not because he's totally separated from those roots. He's actually implicated in too many of them. He's much more difficult to summarize. You could talk about a Weberian or a Nietzschean reading of Morgenthau, a Hobbesian out of Marx and Mannheim reading of Carr. No shorthand like that is available to summarize Waltz's position. Easiest to say there's a rupture here and he's the inventor of something new. I don't think that's true. The reason you can't find a shorthand reading of Waltz is because there's too much to say rather than too little to say. So I think he does link way back into this. Now the final couple of pages, I talk a bit about evolutionary psychology, but my colleague here is about to jump on me and tell me to shut up. Well, these two got two papers. I don't know, are they going to get double length? Yeah, sorry, inside this.
Only if you shut up.
In that case, you're not going to get double length. Just the short version. To my mind, a lot of modern work on evolutionary psychology is quite supportive of the kind of position he is taking. It seems to me evolutionary psychologists have on the whole abandoned the notion of human nature. What they've done is said there's a whole series of mechanisms which could be seen as inherited, evolved, but the combination of those mechanisms into actual behavior means that we don't have a single set of drives that push people forward. Now, there was a really interesting panel at ISA this year, which not enough people went to. I think Dominic Johnson was there, Cosmides, a really big name in the field, various other people. And interesting, they all say, well, Waltz is wrong because he has a constant view of human nature. I thought, that's right, and that's actually wrong. His view is much closer to what you think is the correct view, which is that, you know, there may be certain kinds of drives, but if you want to make sense of them, you've got to combine it with other things. I talk and I'll give you a reference, I have a fascinating paper, do have a look at the reference, to Johnson's work on positive illusions. You know, the sense that we have inherited a kind of natural optimism, which was quite useful out on the African plain, but bloody dangerous when you're playing with boys' toys in the 21st century. And so you do get a point where one of the Nobel laureates says, you know, the bottom line is all the biases in judgment that have been identified by evolutionary psychologists in the last 15 years, biased decision making towards the hawkish side. I think that's quite an interesting point. But the point they really make is, it doesn't work on its own. It has to be combined with so many other things. Personality, environment. So in a sense, they're backing away from the kind of simplified idea that human nature can provide a drive that pushes things forward. I think that is much closer to a Waltzian position than they think it is, or than many realists think it is. So I'll stop there. Only slightly overrunning.
I'm going to stand up to show that I can after that, unlike others. I think when Ken was organising this, he wanted a rambunctious session after lunch. I think that it's already got off to a great start, so I'm going to try and continue in that mold. I should point out to you that I am not an IR theorist specialist, so that should make it more rambunctious than it was before. However, I do have an interest in political ideas and their relationship to political argument and the organisation of debate and the interpretive licenses that flow from that. So, the intention in the paper was to adapt Ken Waltz's celebrated schema of analysis in Man, the State and War for the task of surveying his own situation as an individual, a scholar, and an American citizen set within a context of intellectual, political, and cultural change. So the idea is to employ a version of the classificatory logic of the three images and to apply it back to the author himself and his times. The purpose is to use them to organize a re-examination of some of the work's points of origin, to assess its wider situational relevance within the United States, as well as to survey some of the less evident purposes and undercurrents that originally influenced the exposition. And in this respect, I'm particularly interested in American liberalism. Let me look at the first image. Well, the first image is the individual. Ken Waltz himself. Waltz's personal development must in some way have been influenced by the social and global crises that coincided with his childhood and the formative years of his personal and psychological development. Ken Waltz was born in 1924, so it's 5 years really after the Treaty of Versailles, 5 years before the Great Crash. And when you look at what his life involved, then when you think of World War II coming into the equation, he's 21, 1925, and he served with the armed forces in Korea in the early 50s. So his theme of war, in particular, was not unrelated really to his own personal circumstances. So personal circumstances, they're correlated to international crises that must have impinged in some way upon his consciousness during the progression to personal and intellectual maturity. Now that's a very interesting area, and I think we will have to wait for his biography. When we even his autobiography, who knows, to know more about that. But I thought that his date of birth was extremely suggestive in this period. Now the second image I don't use as the state, but I call the social. When I look at it in the professional context, the rise of social sciences and the professionalization of the social sciences during that period. And when I look at the reviews, this is where historiography comes into the equation, when I look at the reviews of Man, the State and War, they're very revealing, much more revealing than I thought they were going to be. I thought he was going to have a series of rave reviews, but it shows that a book that became a classic was reviewed quite cautiously, actually, at the time. And I thought that's very interesting, bearing in mind what was said this morning about the contextualization of how these things are constructed and how reputations are built. I felt, looking through a number of professional reviews coming after the Man, the State and War, I was reminded of what people see on films, and what I'm reliably informed is the case, of when you were run through by a rapier. You don't quite know what's happened when it occurs, but you know something disastrous has happened to you, but you don't quite know how to react to it. And that's the impression I got from so many of the reviews. They sort of acknowledged the elegance of the argument, but didn't quite know what to do with it. Someone who had more time than most to reflect upon the book was the reviewer in World Politics, because they gave him like 4 or 5 pages to work it through. And his name was J. David Singer. And he recognized the quality of the argumentation in Man, the State and War.
That's David Singer.
Right. Just had a good time. But in the same vein as other reviewers, he rather bridled against what was seen as the undue fatalism of Waltz's insights. He said, "This seems to leave us with the feeling that World War III is inevitable. The Singer's can-do spirit of liberal activism seeps through again and again. He made standard concessions, or they all seem to make standard concessions, the idea that supranational institutions are impossible, utopian, and idealistic. But then he goes on to say, this is a quote from the review, "It is just possible that this intellectual, literary, and verbal effort, if applied to the problem in a more creative and imaginative fashion, might lead us to some way out of the dilemma of perpetual anarchy and its corollary of inevitable war." He goes on, "It seems to this reviewer that here is an assignment worthy of our most vigorous efforts as scholars and as human beings. By dismissing it as an impossibility, we only help to hasten the day when the skies will be filled with nuclear-headed missiles, raining destruction and devastation on man and everything that he has created." And in other reviews, it was evident that the impulse to recognize the power and elegance of Waltz's exegesis coincided with a sort of reluctance to give it an unequivocal welcome. And obviously, it appeared that its conclusions were difficult to accommodate. I thought that was very, very interesting from what became a classic later on. The second part of the social side of the second image, I just call Cold War liberalism. Waltz's view of the international system of states and the Cold War's archetypal expression of that system's durability provoked disquiet, not just within the strategic and theoretical circles, but also within the wider sphere of public discourse and social patterns of thought. Waltz's context in this respect was one that would have been heavily influenced by the dominant post-World War II American paradigm of liberal supremacy. The mainstream during this era of US politics was almost invariably conceived in terms of a transcendent American liberalism. Within this construct, the problems of industrialization and modernization were construed to have been effectively resolved. The only disputes that remained were those that could be negotiated to a satisfactory solution through the use of technical adjustments. The deeper significance of this ubiquitous presence of liberalism was largely defined by the exponents of consensus history. They claimed that the circumstances of American development had bestowed upon the country a unified experience which was characterized by the indigenous presence of a particular value structure. By far the most influential of these consensus historians cum social theorists was Lewis Hartz. The liberal tradition in America not only became the most cited book on Cold War precepts in the 1950s, but was seen in its own right as an iconic reflection on American political culture and about the challenges confronting the United States, and in particular, the need for the country to comprehend its own past and its current identity. Now, Lewis Hart's sweeping study of American society and its usage of American political ideas led him to advance the proposition of an exceptional society in which there was only one estate. It was governed by a single and integrated set of core liberal values. The notion of an inherently liberal moral consensus was not only presented as the only plausible conception of the United States social evolution, but it was regarded as instrumental in consolidating the social cohesion and ideological mobilization to engage in the Cold War. For Hartz, the linkages to liberalism were less the consequence of rational inquiry and analytical preference than the outcome of a visceral and reflective traditionalism that in effect fused together both Locke and Burke. As he said, the settlement of deep moral questions on the basis of a submerged and absolute liberal faith had marked the end of speculation upon them. In many respects, Hartz's combination of historiography and political theory amounted to a celebration of America's sense of difference as a social and interpretive phenomenon. But what many people forget when they look at Hartz and his depiction of exceptionalism is that it cut both ways. There is a final chapter in the liberal tradition of the United States, and it had a sting in the tail. It offered a powerful critique of the United States' position towards the world. Far from confirming the US's position as a mature international power, the Hartzian view was that the Cold War had merely thrown the fundamental ambivalence of this most liberal of cultures into high relief. The thrust of the argument was that America had developed a liberal absolutism. It was not only unaware of its conformity, but was quite incapable of comprehending a world outside that had not undergone the experience of the United States. The tenets of liberalism may have been universal in theory, but in the American context, they were conjoined to a compulsive and largely ingrown set of attachments. The net effect was that the United States had a very volatile view of the world that fluctuated between withdrawal and engagement. Now, withdrawal was based upon the Republic's escapist past from European decadence and its subsequent suspicion of that which lay beyond the sanctuary of its own liberal terms of reference. American engagement abroad was similarly rooted in a narrowly conceived liberal impulse that justified action through the unsustainable rationale of international transformation. Hartz concluded that the continual shifting between these two poles was the uncomfortable consequence of America's rootedness in liberal fundamentalism. Hartz talks of an absolute national morality that is transpired either to withdraw from alien things or to transform them. It cannot live in comfort constantly by their side. This is the outlook that is derived from the absolute perspective, this is Hartz now, absolute perspective of America's liberal community and the peculiar link that it forges between the world and domestic pictures. I thought you'd like that quote from Hartz, because he was also interested in pictures. For a historian of American liberalism, Hartz is significantly skeptical over whether the American liberal mind could ever transcend its own very limited horizons, i.e., whether it could ever understand peoples elsewhere, and even whether it could ever understand itself. Well, that book was published in 1955. The American Political Science Association immediately awarded it with the Woodrow Wilson Award in 1956. But it's these self-same issues of liberalism, its principles, its outlooks, and its organizing hopes and logics that feature so strongly, from an outsider's point of view, in Man, the State, and War. In tracing the various iterations of liberalism in this era, and their different approaches to the issue of security and international order, Waltz settles upon much the same duality that Hartz uses to portray the strains within contemporary liberalism. That is, those that are exhibited in the issue of the liberal construction of international relations. Now, this isn't to claim that Waltz was taking his cue from Hartz. What is noteworthy is that in their respective works, they both use the figure of Woodrow Wilson to depict the deep fault lines within liberalism in respect to the place of war in the processes of international politics. Man, the State, and War reveals that Waltz had very similar reservations to Louis Hartz over the liberal excesses of Wilsonianism. Waltz divided liberals into two camps in that book: non-interventionist liberals. They depended more on historical forces, notions of progress, and the educative effect of model liberal democracies to create an evolutionary process towards peaceful world order. But the other camp, they were quite different. Messianic interventionists, he calls them. They were liberals who disputed the mechanisms of international change. In place of what they regarded as a self-abnegating gradualism, liberal interventionists placed their trust in the transformative exertion of power in order to shift the environment into a more progressive direction. He said that Woodrow Wilson broke new ground by extending the prospectus of engagement to the point of promoting an international organization designed to perform governmental functions. Liberals previously had rejected international organizations as unnecessary and regressive. Woodrow Wilson's advocacy of such a scheme marked, in Waltz's terms, a turning point. It disclosed an impulse in liberalism that was both hubristic and dangerous. Waltz applies the critique to all forms of interventionist liberalism, which ascribes to itself a moral obligation to provide final solutions to war. And this is a quote from his book: "Interventionist liberals are not content with a realism that may prolong the era of war forever. Their realism lies in rejecting the assumption of an automatic progress in history, and in the consequent assertion that men must eliminate the causes of war if they are to enjoy peace. Their realism involves them in utopian assumptions that are frightening in their implications. The state that would act on the interventionist theory must set itself up as both the judge and executor in the affairs of nations." To Waltz, these liberals would aim, as he said, to make a leap into the future and take us all with them. This would lead to extravagant wars and to an unsettled peace. So he concluded that this form of liberalism was dangerously flawed. It was a broken prospectus because it was based on a misunderstanding of international politics. So that brings me to the idea of the third image applied back to Waltz, the international. As a political theorist and political analyst, Waltz cannot be seen as being entirely divorced from the state of liberal anxieties that were current at the time, the 1950s. Now, American liberalism had emerged from World War II with a renewed affirmation of confidence in the grandeur and virtue of the liberal ethos. But this was qualified by an unnerving disquiet over the implications of mass politics, and in particular over the dangers of unmediated forms of political engagement. This concern over the prospect of unstable structures of mass opinion was reflected in the work of such contemporary intellectual figures as Richard Hofstadter, Walter Lippmann, Lionel Trilling, Daniel Bell, Hannah Arendt, Dwight MacDonald, and Reinhold Niebuhr. The destruction, cruelty, and slaughter of World War II gave pause for skeptical thought. Liberal triumph coincided with liberal dismay. It generated an ambiguous mix. Now, in terms of foreign policy and its domestic significance, American liberals were continually under strain from the need to respond to two primary sources of tension. First was the need to defend themselves against the new charge of being soft on communism. The second source of tension was derived from a long-term discomfort over the energies and purposes of American populism. The insurgent properties of populist politics could induce volatile movements of opinion that could attach themselves in unpredictable and damaging ways to an eclectic range of public issues. Because these accelerated surges of mass protests were fueled by notions of exclusion and cultural disinheritance, they tended to operate outside the normal channels of political mediation. And to that extent, they could be seen as raw and unrefined and confrontational, with a disposition towards sentiments of anti-politics, to simplistic analyses and agendas, and usually to negative and often intolerant positions. Liberals in the United States have had an uneasy relationship with populists in the past, and it can be claimed they still do so today. But in the 1950s, liberals often felt compelled to accommodate the reservations and objections of populists. Both sources of tension, for example, were dramatically combined in McCarthyism, which led many liberals to develop a highly defensive reaction to foreign policy and a generally hawkish outlook to the communist threat. In many respects, the very fluctuation in attitudes towards the world that Lewis Hartz complained about was rooted more in the volatile nature of US populism and its feverish forms of illiberal democracy. Nevertheless, Hartz's critique was as much directed towards Cold War liberals as it was towards their tormentors. Now, whether or not Kenneth Waltz's classic analysis of international relations theory was designed with this liberal predicament in mind is open to debate. But what is apparent is that his claim of an existent structural realism offered a way out of the Hartzian duality to the liberal mind. In essence, Waltz seemed to be proposing a stable realism fit for the bipolarity of the Cold War. Stability in this context offered a shaft of liberal optimism in the form of a functioning system, guided by its own dynamics of equilibrium. In other words, it was possible for American liberalism, and thereby the United States, to achieve a stable and sustainable form of international engagement without falling prey to the violent swings between the Hartzian extremes of transformative change and reactive dissociation. To Waltz, the dynamics of international bipolarity had in fact enhanced the possibility of resolving the chronic nature of liberalism's own bipolarity. Waltz underlined the reassuring existence of a steady-state framework of world politics in which the United States could operate as a settled political player within that process. As such, it could operate without recourse to its traditionally episodic dislocations, drawn from its self-conscious exertions in vivid engagement and principled disavowal. Waltzian realism offered a more attractive prospect to liberals than the darker and more pessimistic brands of realism. Of course, the extent to which Waltz's assurance conditions subsequent liberal responses to international developments and foreign policy crises still remains an issue that is open to conjecture. Thank you.
standing. I wave my arms about too much when I stand up. I'll move that away as well, since I'll just blow all your ears out otherwise. This is a paper which has a troubled past and makes me presented with some considerable trepidation. I'm not quite sure where it goes. I'm not quite sure that it's right. It's kind of taken on a bit of a life of its own over the last week. And in my case, papers that take on lives of their own tend to be not flights of genius, but more things like Frankenstein, right? And they go out and they wander about and they thrash the town folk and generate various forms of resistance, and little cabals of scientific realists arrive with torches and pitchforks and seek to both destroy both the creation and the creator. So I hope that that isn't what's going to happen with this paper. But here it goes. This paper is called Waltz, Realism, and Democracy. If I was to present this paper in a different context, let's say at the APSRA meetings, I could already hear the squeals, I think, from the audience. I could hear Randall Schweller spinning about in his chair at the back already. God, what's this? Waltz and democracy. Waltz doesn't have anything to say about domestic level, unit level factors. Right? And I am aware of Barry's, where is he? There he is, admonition this morning that maybe we're in danger of turning Waltz into everything that ever walked, just reflecting our own predilections. I don't think that's true. And I want to pick up on something that John Mearsheimer said this morning about the centrality of domestic politics for Waltz. I am very, very conscious that I may be letting myself open here for a complete skewering by the person who I'm talking about, saying that absolutely what I'm saying has absolutely nothing to do with what he actually meant. But I'm going to give it a go anyway. I'm going to argue that domestic politics are not separate from Waltz's concerns. I'm going to argue that domestic politics are actually central to Waltz's concerns. Moreover, I'm going to argue that Waltz is deeply, deeply concerned with the question of democracy. That is, that Waltz's theory of international politics is also a theory of domestic politics in the sense of the question of the democratic control over foreign policy. To make this case, I'm going to do something that, bless his soul, Chris Hill brought up before me yesterday, so it doesn't sound quite so outlandish. I'm going to turn to the third of Waltz's great books, the longest book that he ever wrote, the one that almost nobody ever talks about, the one that when I checked it out of the library in Aberystwyth hadn't been taken out for 11 years until I laid my paws on it. It is an absolutely fascinating book called Foreign Policy and Domestic Politics. As Chris said yesterday, published in 1967, the other way around, Democratic Politics and Foreign Policy. There you go, I knew I'd get that wrong. I thought I got it right. I'll write that down now. Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy. Yeah, I did take it out, it's in my office. The book was published in 1967, but as came up yesterday, it reflects very much the concerns of the 1950s. And I want to use this book as a way of arguing that Waltz's concerns with the domestic and with democracy need to be taken from not even the marginal, they've been way over-marginalized, and actually made, if not central, at least pretty close to central. There's two fascinating things for me about this book. The first is that if anybody bothered to read it today, they would find that many of the debates that go on around so-called neoclassical realism and all the rest of this stuff are largely irrelevant because Waltz has already done them. Okay? If you take a look at some of his analyses, this book is an analysis in part, mainly using its empirical work, of British and American foreign policies in their domestic political contexts. Waltz has a fascinating discussion of British foreign policy, especially the way in which the British, relatively, as he puts it, gracefully retired from a position of world leadership, which he reads largely in terms of British political culture and institutions. It is what he calls a mannered approach to foreign policy. And he has, and this is if I could ever put one quiz question together on the APSA website, who said this? He says, in foreign policy, external manner parallels internal procedure. Read constructivism, Read neoclassical realism, read whatever you want, but basically read Waltz, and you find out that these ideas are hardly foreign to the great corpus of structural realism. That's the easy shot that you can take at a whole bunch of people. I want to argue there's a second and much, much more interesting thing here. And to get at this, we've got to go to context, which is, I'm going to take my lead from Chris here. That the context is crucial. And the crucial context here, it seems to me, is the nature of classical realism in the early through late 1950s, and the way in which the classical realist conception of international relations was tied in the United States to a deep sense of foreboding over the ability of the United States to make effective foreign policy, and more generally over the ability of democracies as a whole to actually compete effectively in international anarchy. At the core of this argument, this ran across many, many, many classical realists. Let me see if I can give you just 4 kind of examples. But at the core of this argument was really a claim about the relationship between subjectivity, or the modern individual, if you like, society, and political order. For Hans Morgenthau, whose name didn't come up last night, although Colin tried to chuck it in there, but who I would definitely put in, this was a question of the relationship between scientific man, rationalism, decadent liberalism, whatever one wants to call it, and the inability of democracies to actually act effectively to defend themselves. For Reinhold Niebuhr, it was the loss of Augustinian senses of politics. We often think, for example, of Reinhold Niebuhr's thinking about international politics in terms of his great book, The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness. The Children of Light and the Children of Darkness, of course, was a book about democracy, not a book about international politics per se at all. Right? The subtitle is A Defense of Democracy. Take another example, George Kennan. One reads George Kennan's memoirs, what does one find? Well, a pretty depressed dude, right? Kennan looks around, it's an unhappy world. What does he see? Disenchantment, the loss of the Protestant ethic, the loss of political community, rampant urbanism, consumerism. You know, you read Kennan, he thinks the world is going all to hell. In fact, he's positive it is, right? And he thinks one of the consequences of it going all to hell domestically is that that is connected to foreign policy making. My best example here, and it's the best example because it's the one that in fact forms the center point, if you're looking at the book from this perspective, of Waltz's engagement, is somebody who we almost never read in IR anymore, and I sure wish we did, who was one of the most influential theorists, but the most influential public commentator of the time, a man by the name of Walter Lippmann. Right? What did Lippmann have to say? Well, Lippmann's really an interesting guy. On the one hand, he comes out of a long tradition of pragmatism. Comes out of James and all kinds of progressive politics. On the other hand, as he evolves in his thinking and his social analysis, Lippmann becomes incredibly skeptical, jaded, cynical about modern politics and democratic politics. He argues under conditions of modern media, there is no such thing as democracy. There's only what he calls the phantom public, right? That is, this public that is simply represented to a public as itself. Under these conditions, Lippmann increasingly argues the idea of a democratic politics, at almost any level, is literally asinine. The idea of a democratic foreign policy is not only deeply misguided, but probably absolutely dangerous. And the best thing that you can hope for is a control by some kind of expert elite, because those are the only people who can conceivably handle these problems when a public is incapable structurally of doing so itself. Why is Lippmann so important? Lippmann is so important, I think, because in his book, Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy, Waltz directly engages with Lippmann's arguments, particularly in his book, The Public Philosophy. He argues that if one believes Lippmann's arguments to be true, democratic foreign policy making is in deep trouble. He argues, moreover, that even if one doesn't accept how radical Lippmann's construction of this is a remarkably broadly held view amongst American foreign policy and indeed political science elites. He goes through 5 names that I would like to list off to you of people who share this deep unease. Some of them are still familiar to us, some of them maybe less so. V.O. Key, great American political scientists. Gabriel Almond, I believe, died just last week, if I saw the obituary right. Yeah, I think so. Okay, the great comparativist. W.W. Rostow, hardly somebody unknown in American foreign policy making. Here's Henry Kissinger. And my own personal favorite, given my interest in the neocons, and fascinatingly that he pops up in this book, Irving Kristol, key mover of the American neoconservative movement. Right. He also notes, and this is something I have to ask him about a little bit later, that this deep unease was also central in the policy world. He links it to the rather dire recommendations and analysis of the Gator Committee, 1957, if my memory serves me correctly. He also links it very cryptically in one little footnote to a series of meetings, expert meetings convened under the auspices of the Rockefeller Foundation. I was lucky enough to be on an ISA panel with John Mearsheimer and Mick Conks last spring. It was a very good paper by a guy by the name of Nick Guillot, who's at the SSRC, who's done work in the Rockefeller Foundation archives. And it turns out that in the early 1950s, the Rockefeller Foundation, under the leadership of Kenneth Thompson, convened a whole series of seminars basically designed on the one hand to combat the increasing rationalism of American political science, but on the other hand, to formulate questions about the cultural relationship between culture and foreign policy. The people who were invited to these things included Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, George Kennan, and all the like. If I'm correct that this footnote refers to the same set of meetings, and if Guillot is correct, and I hope I can get some confirmation on this today, the rapporteur for those meetings was none other than a graduate student by the name of Kenneth Waltz. This is not a series of debates with which Waltz was unfamiliar. What is crucial, I want to argue, is that Waltz rejects the conclusions that classical realists draw about the nature of domestic politics and the nature, particularly, of contemporary American domestic politics and its relationship to democratic foreign policy. I want to argue that this may not be Waltz's central concern in the whole world, but it's a crucial concern. And that it pervades, or at least I'm going to make it pervade, his entire corpus. This is a lens through which you can read Waltz's three great books. Very briefly, Man, the State, and War. We read Man, the State, and War as a methodological text, largely a philosophical inquiry, a theoretical analysis, it's called. Right? Read it politically. What is it doing? It's attacking first and second image theory. Where did the dire conclusions of classical realism come from? First and second image thinking. If you could do away with the validity of first and second image thinking, if man and the state were no longer the preconditions of foreign policy, then the dire conclusions which followed from this reading of democracy in general and American democracy in particular no longer followed either. In other words, Man, the State, and War is a political prophylactic. It is designed to insulate democracy from the coercive acids of classical realism. The second theme is the book Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy. What is the conclusion of domestic politics and foreign policy? It is this. It seeks to provide evidence that when closely examined, despite the claims of everybody who I listed earlier, Kissinger, Kristol, Rostow, and the rest, democracies are actually not bad at making foreign policy. In fact, Waltz argues, if you take a look at the historical record, British and American foreign policy is no worse than any other kind of state's foreign policy. In other words, the idea that this is the high road to hell is simply not true. What's more, he argues, American foreign policy, particularly Republican forms of foreign policy, may in fact be the best forms of making foreign policy because they are most able, through the checks and balances structure built into them, to respond effectively through internal critique to changes in the international system. In other words, democracies are certainly no worse than any other form of polity. They may in fact even be better. Thirdly, and this is the trickiest one, I agree, theory of international politics. Read from this perhaps idiosyncratic lens, theory of international politics explains why this is the case. Man, the State, and War shows how classical realists are wrong. The Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy book demonstrates that they are wrong. Theory of international politics explains why it is different than they think it is. In other words, it is the final brick in the wall which demonstrates that since foreign policy is caused, it's all realistic. Since a structural account is what makes foreign policy tick, if you like, or state action, the question of state form doesn't matter. In this way, Waltz has, I think, provided a threefold defense of democratic foreign policy making. He has, I would argue, in theory of international politics, provided a remarkably powerful political rhetoric in defense of it. He has literally walled off all of the concerns of the classical realists. Right? They simply no longer apply. They might be right. They're probably wrong. But either way, they don't matter. Because they're fundamentally wrong about the relationship between domestic politics and foreign politics. In this way, I would like to argue three conclusions all. The first, and John talked about this, and a number of other people have talked about it already, so do Chris just now. Waltz is optimistic. This is not dire realism, circa Hans Morgenthau. It's certainly not the kind of down-in-the-mouth realism of George Kenneth. Secondly, domestic politics are not marginal to Waltz. They are central. And thirdly, the great misunderstood element of Waltz's theory of international politics is that the most important part of it is that Waltz is a Democrat.